What happens when a system built on silence meets a disaster that cannot be silenced? In the early hours of April 26, 1986, reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in the Soviet Union exploded, releasing radioactive material that spread across large areas of Europe and altered the lives of millions of people who never saw the plant and never knew its name. Tonight, I am here with Rowan Hartsteele.
Good evening, Clara.
Chernobyl is often discussed as a technical failure, and the technical failure is real, but the investigation that followed revealed that the conditions which made the accident possible were not primarily technical. They were institutional. Tonight, we turn to a disaster that demonstrated how a culture of silence, hierarchy, and the suppression of bad news can transform a manageable risk into a catastrophe. The question is not only what caused the explosion at Chernobyl, but what kind of system makes it possible for the conditions of a catastrophe to accumulate invisibly until the moment they become unstoppable.
The Chernobyl disaster was the product of a specific interaction between a reactor with known design vulnerabilities, operators working under instructions that did not fully account for those vulnerabilities, and an institutional culture in which acknowledging risk or questioning authority carried professional and political consequences that most people were not willing to accept.
We are speaking about the Chernobyl disaster of April 1986, one of the most severe nuclear accidents in history, and one of the most consequential institutional failures of the 20th century.
Its consequences extended across national borders, lasted for decades, and contributed to a fundamental shift in how the world understood nuclear energy, safety culture, and the relationship between technological ambition and institutional transparency.
Then, let us begin with the reactor, the test, and the chain of decisions that converged on the night of April 25th to 26th.
The Chernobyl plant used a reactor design known as the RBMK, a Soviet graphite-moderated boiling water reactor. The RBMK was a large, powerful design that had been deployed across the Soviet Union. It had significant advantages from a production standpoint. It could be refueled while operating and used unenriched uranium, which was easier to produce. It also had a significant design flaw that Soviet authorities had not communicated fully, even to the plant operators who worked with it. The flaw involved what is called the positive void coefficient. In most Western reactor designs, if the cooling water begins to boil and form steam voids, the nuclear reaction slows down. In the RBMK, under certain conditions, particularly at low power levels, the formation of steam voids actually increased the reaction rate. The reactor could, in specific circumstances, accelerate its own power output as it became less stable. This characteristic was known to Soviet reactor designers, but had been classified. The operators at Chernobyl did not have full knowledge of it.
So the people responsible for operating the reactor did not have complete information about how it could fail.
Yes, and here is the first thing we need to correct about the standard account. Chernobyl is often described as a disaster caused primarily by operator error. The Soviet government initially promoted this explanation, which served to locate responsibility in the individuals present, rather than in the system that had placed them there. The subsequent international investigation, particularly after the Soviet Union acknowledged more of the technical record, showed that the reactor's design characteristics were an essential precondition of the accident, not a background detail. The immediate context of the disaster was a safety test. The test was designed to determine whether the turbines of the reactor, as they spun down after a shutdown, could generate enough electricity to power the emergency cooling pumps during the brief interval before backup. Diesel generators came online. This test had been attempted 3 times previously without a definitive result. On the 4th attempt, it was scheduled for the night shift of April 25th to 26th.
So the test was a legitimate safety procedure, not a reckless experiment.
Yes, but the conditions under which it was conducted had been compromised before the night shift even began. The test had been delayed earlier in the day by demand from the Kiev grid controller to keep the reactor producing power during peak consumption. By the time the night shift took over, the reactor had been running at full power for an extended period, and had accumulated a buildup of xenon-135, a fission product that absorbs neutrons and suppresses the Ke reaction. This xenon poisoning was making the reactor difficult to control. The night shift operators, under pressure to complete the long-delayed test, attempted to bring the reactor to the required low power level for the test. During this process, the power dropped further than intended, to near zero, due to the xenon poisoning. The reactor was in a deeply unstable condition. The correct procedure at this point was to abandon the test and wait approximately 24 hours for the xenon to decay before attempting again. The decision was made to proceed.
So the decision to continue was made precisely when the conditions were least safe.
Yes, and understanding why requires understanding the institutional environment. The test had been delayed repeatedly. Senior management was present and expecting completion. In a system where demonstrating competence and meeting schedules carried significant weight, and where raising concerns about safety could be interpreted as obstructionism or incompetence, the pressure to proceed was institutional as much as it was personal. The operators stabilized the reactor at a low power level, withdrew more control rods than safety regulations permitted, in order to maintain the reaction, and began the test. At 1:23 in the morning, the emergency core cooling system was disabled as part of the test procedure. Seconds after the test began, power began rising rapidly. The shift foreman ordered an emergency shutdown. The control rods were inserted. Due to a design flaw in the tip of the control rods, their insertion caused a brief surge in reactivity before suppressing it. The power spike was too fast and too large for the reactor to survive.
So the emergency shutdown itself contributed to the explosion.
Yes, the control rod tip flaw was another known design characteristic that had not been communicated to operators. At 1:23 and 47 seconds, 2 explosions destroyed the reactor and blew the roof off the building. Radioactive material was ejected into the atmosphere. Fires began on the roof and in surrounding the operators in the control room, several of whom received lethal radiation doses in the following hours, initially did not fully understand what had happened. The instruments that remained functional showed readings that seemed impossible. The first responders were firefighters from the local station, who arrived within minutes and began fighting the fires on the roof of the reactor building. They were not informed of the radiation levels they were entering. Their dosimeters were inadequate to measure the actual exposure. Many of them received radiation doses that would prove fatal within weeks. They approached the disaster with the tools and the understanding appropriate to a conventional fire, because that was the information they had been given them.
So the institutional silence about the true nature of the accident extended to the people whose lives depended on knowing.
Yes. The city of Pripyat, home to approximately 49,000 people, and located less than 3 kilometers from the plant, was not evacuated until 36 hours after the explosion. During that time, residents went about their daily lives, including attending a wedding, playing outdoors, and going to school, while radioactive fallout settled on the city. The delay was a consequence of the Soviet institutional culture, in which acknowledging a catastrophe required authorization from authorities who were themselves reluctant to accept the scale of what had happened. The scale of the disaster only became internationally apparent when radiation alarms began triggering at the Forsmark nuclear power plant in Sweden on April 28, 2 days after the explosion. Workers at Forsmark were found to be contaminated with radioactive particles. When the source was traced, it became clear that the contamination was coming from the Soviet Union. Only then did the Soviet authorities make a public acknowledgement, and even then the initial statement was minimal.
So the disaster was disclosed to the world not by Soviet announcement, but by a Swedish radiation alarm.
Precisely. And this sequence reveals something essential about the relationship between institutional culture and disaster management. The Soviet system had been optimized to prevent bad news from flowing upward, and to prevent failure from being visible externally. That optimization did not make the radiation less real. It simply ensured that the people with the authority to respond were the last to know the full truth of what had happened. The containment response that followed involved hundreds of thousands of people, referred to as liquidators, who were brought in to clean up the site, build the initial concrete sarcophagus over the destroyed reactor, and manage the exclusion zone. Many of these workers received significant radiation doses. The health consequences for the liquidator population have been studied for decades, though the full picture remains contested due to the complexity of measuring long-term low-dose radiation effects in a large and geographically dispersed population. The broader context of Soviet nuclear ambition is essential for understanding why the RBMK reactor was built, the way it was, and why its flaws were not disclosed. The Soviet nuclear program was a source of national pride and strategic prestige. Nuclear power stations were presented as symbols of socialist achievement. Within this framework, acknowledging design flaws in a deployed reactor was not simply a technical matter. It was a political problem that reflected on the competence of the state and on the integrity of the program.
So the political meaning attached to the technology was itself a safety hazard.
Yes, and this dynamic is not unique to the Soviet Union. Any system in which the symbolic value of a technology is tied to the authority of the institution operating it creates an incentive to protect the symbol by minimizing the visibility of problems. The specific political context of the Soviet Union made this dynamic more extreme and more consequential, but the underlying structure appears wherever prestige, authority, and technological performance are bundled together. The personal stories of the individuals at the center of the disaster illuminate the human scale of the institutional failure. Alexander Akimov, the shift foreman who ordered the emergency shutdown, believed until his death from radiation sickness 13 days later that he had done nothing wrong and that the reactor must have had a different cause of failure. He had followed the procedures he understood. The procedures were inadequate because his understanding of the reactor's behavior had been incomplete from the beginning.
So the operators were themselves victims of the same information gap that contributed to the accident.
Yes, Anatoly Dyatlov, years in prison, his own account, written during and after his imprisonment, insisted that the reactor's design flaws, not his decisions, were the primary cause of the accident. The truth, as the subsequent technical analysis showed, was that both were necessary conditions. The design flaw created the vulnerability. His decisions placed the reactor in the specific state where that vulnerability became fatal. The construction of the new safe confinement structure, completed in 2016, replaced the original concrete sarcophagus that had been built in the immediate aftermath of the disaster. The original sarcophagus was a remarkable achievement of engineering under extreme conditions, assembled by thousands of workers in conditions of significant radiation exposure. It was also inherently temporary. The new structure, an arch of steel over 100 meters high, is designed to contain the site for at least 100 years while decommissioning work proceeds.
So the management of the Chernobyl site will continue for generations, beyond the lifetimes of anyone who experienced the original disaster.
Yes, and this is one of the features of nuclear accidents that distinguishes them from most other technological disasters. The timescale of consequence extends far beyond the timescale of responsibility. The decisions made by individuals in April 1986 created obligations that will be carried by people who were not yet born when those decisions were made. This temporal asymmetry between the moment of failure and the duration of consequence is one of the most important ethical dimensions of the Chernobyl legacy.
Before we close tonight, let us take a brief pause and welcome Margaret Evernight. Margaret, for those who want to understand the human dimension of Chernobyl beyond the technical and political analysis, where would you invite them to continue?
Thank you, Clara. In this case, the most direct path is also the most important one. I would suggest beginning with Voices from Chernobyl by Svetlana Alexievich.
So this is a book built entirely from the testimonies of people who lived through the disaster and its aftermath.
Alexievich presents first-hand accounts from firefighters, workers, families, and evacuees, capturing the human dimension of the nuclear accident beyond technical analysis. The narratives reveal how individuals understood, endured, and remembered the event, offering a perspective on the emotional and social consequences of Chernobyl that no institutional report could provide.
Is it accessible to readers without prior knowledge of the disaster or of Soviet history?
The book requires no technical or historical background. Each testimony stands on its own as a human document. Alexievich allows her subjects to speak in their own voices, with minimal editorial framing. The effect is immediate and lasts. A reader who knows nothing about Chernobyl before opening the book will understand what it meant to the people who lived through it.
So it gives the reader the inside of the disaster, the experience of people for whom the accident was not a historical event, but a rupture in the fabric of ordinary life.
Precisely. Alexievich was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature in part for this work. The book is a reminder that technological disasters are not only engineering problems. They are human experiences, and those experiences must be part of how we understand and remember what happened.
Thank you, Margaret. That is a thoughtful place to pause tonight.
Thank you, Clara. It was a pleasure.
The immediate institutional legacy of Chernobyl was the acceleration of a transparency crisis within the Soviet Union. Mikhail Gorbachev later stated that Chernobyl was perhaps the true cause of the collapse of the Soviet Union, more than anything else. The disaster demonstrated publicly and irrefutably that the Soviet system was capable of allowing a catastrophe of this scale to develop, and then of responding with denial and concealment rather than accountability. The credibility damage was severe and lasting. The international nuclear industry underwent significant reform following Chernobyl. The International Atomic Energy Agency strengthened its safety standards and its inspection mechanisms. The concept of safety culture, defined as the set of organizational values and behaviors that make safety the overriding priority, became central to nuclear regulatory frameworks worldwide. The RBMK reactor design was modified to address the positive void coefficient flaw. New protocols for emergency communication and evacuation were developed.
So the disaster produced genuine and substantial reform in how nuclear safety was regulated internationally.
Yes, but the deeper lesson about the relationship between institutional culture and safety proved harder to institutionalize. The same year that the Columbia Space Shuttle was lost, 2003, an independent review of the nuclear industry noted that pressures to maintain production schedules, manage costs, and avoid the appearance of problems had created conditions in several facilities that bore uncomfortable resemblances to the pre-accident culture at Chernobyl. The specific technical context was different. The organizational dynamics were recognizable. The environmental legacy of Chernobyl continues to be studied and debated. The exclusion zone around the plant, covering approximately 2,600 square kilometers, remains largely uninhabited. Parts of it have become an inadvertent nature reserve, where wildlife has returned in the absence of human activity. Though contamination persists in the soil and in certain food chains, the long-term health consequences of the accident, particularly the thyroid cancer increases observed in children who were exposed to radioactive iodine in the immediate aftermath, are well documented. Other health effects remain subjects of ongoing scientific investigation.
So the physical consequences of the disaster are still unfolding decades later.
Yes. And this temporal dimension of the consequences is one of the features that makes Chernobyl uniquely instructive as a case study. Most industrial accidents produce consequences that are visible quickly and resolve over a defined period. The consequences of a major nuclear accident extend across generations and across geography in ways that challenge normal frameworks of accountability and remediation. The people who made the decisions in April 1986 are no longer alive. The consequences of those decisions are. The modern relevance of Chernobyl extends to every domain where complex technology is operated within institutional structures that carry incentives to minimize the visibility of problems. The transition to renewable energy infrastructure, the expansion of artificial intelligence systems, the management of global financial networks, all of these involve complex technologies operated within hierarchical institutions where the same dynamics of silence, normalization of risk and pressure to maintain performance can operate.
So Chernobyl is not only a story about nuclear power, it is a story about what happens when the structure of an institution makes honesty about risk more costly than silence.
Precisely. The reactor at Chernobyl engineers were incompetent or because Soviet war. It exploded because a series of people at every level of a hierarchy, from the designers who did not disclose the full characteristics of the reactor to the operators who did not abandon a compromised test to the officials who delayed evacuation, each made decisions within a system that punished honesty and rewarded the appearance of control. The explosion was the moment the appearance of control became impossible to maintain.
Thank you for staying with us tonight, and thank you, Rowan, for guiding us through the reactor flaw, the night of the test, the silence that followed, and what Chernobyl continues to teach us about the cost of institutional cultures that cannot afford to hear the truth.
Chernobyl reminds us that the most dangerous thing in any complex system is not the flaw that is known and disclosed. It is the flaw that is known and hidden.
If this conversation stayed with you, you are welcome to like, comment, and subscribe. You will find other episodes here where history, ideas, and power are approached slowly. Until next time, stay with us.